Chapter 5. The Reverend Amos Barton, whose sad fortunes I have undertaken to relate, was, you perceive, in no respect an ideal or exceptional character, and perhaps I am doing a bold thing to bespeak your sympathy on behalf of a man who was so very far from remarkable, a man whose virtues were not heroic, and who had no undetected crime within his breast, who had not the slightest mystery hanging about him, but was palpably and unmistakably commonplace, who was not even in love, but had had that complaint favourably many years ago. An utterly uninteresting character, I think I hear a lady reader exclaim. Mrs. Farthingale, for example, who prefers the ideal in fiction, to whom tragedy means Ermine Tippett's adultery and murder, and comedy the adventures of some personage who is quite a character. But, my dear madam, it is so very large a majority of your fellow countrymen that are of this insignificant stamp. At least 80 out of 100 of your adult male fellow Britons returned in the last census are neither extraordinarily silly, nor extraordinarily wicked, nor extraordinarily wise. Their eyes are neither deep and liquid with sentiment, nor sparkling with suppressed witticisms. They've probably had no hair-breadth escapes or thrilling adventures. Their brains are certainly not pregnant with genius, and their passions have not manifested themselves at all after the fashion of a volcano. They are simply men of complexions more or less muddy, whose conversation is more or less bald and disjointed. Yet these commonplace people, many of them, bear a conscience and have felt the sublime prompting to do the painful right. They have their unspoken sorrows and their sacred joys. Their hearts have perhaps gone out towards their firstborn, and they have mourned over the irreclaimable dead. Nay, is there not a pathos in their very insignificance, in our comparison of their dim and narrow existence with the glorious possibilities of that human nature which they share? Depend upon it, you would gain unspeakably if you would learn with me to see some of the poetry and the pathos, the tragedy and the comedy, lying in the experience of a human soul that looks out through dull grey eyes, and that speaks in a voice of quite ordinary tones. In that case I should have no fear of your not caring to know what farther befell the Reverend Amos Barton, or of your thinking the homely details I have to tell are all beneath your attention. As it is, you can, if you please, decline to pursue my story farther, and you will easily find reading more to your taste, since I learn from the newspapers that many remarkable novels, full of striking situations, thrilling incidents, and eloquent writing, have appeared only within the last season. Meanwhile, readers who have begun to feel an interest in the Reverend Amos Barton and his wife will be glad to learn that Mr. Oldinport lent the £20. But £20 are soon exhausted when 12 are due as back payment to the butcher, and when the possession of 8 extra sovereigns in February weather is an irresistible temptation to order a new greatcoat. And though Mr. Bridmain, so far departed from the necessary economy entailed on him by the Countess's elegant toilette and expensive maid, as to choose a handsome black silk, stiff, as his experienced eye discerned, with the genuine strength of its own texture, and not with a factitious strength of gum, and present it to Mrs. Barton in retrieval of the accident that had occurred at his table, yet, dear me, as every husband has heard, what is the present of a gown when you are deficiently furnished with the et ceteras of apparel, and when, moreover, there are 6 children, whose wear and tear of clothes is something incredible to the non-maternal mind? Indeed, the equation of income and expenditure was offering new and constantly accumulating difficulties to Mr. and Mrs. Barton. For shortly after the birth of little Walter, Milly's aunt, who had lived with her ever since her marriage, had withdrawn herself, her furniture, and her yearly income to the household of another niece, prompted to that step very probably by a slight tiff with the Reverend Amos, which occurred while Milly was upstairs, and proved one too many for the elderly lady's patience and magnanimity. Mr. Barton's temper was a little warm, but on the other hand elderly maiden ladies are known to be susceptible, so we will not suppose that all the blame lay on his side. The less so, as he had every motive for humouring an inmate whose presence kept the wolf from the door. It was now nearly a year since Miss Jackson's departure, and to a fine ear the howl of the wolf was audibly approaching. It was a sad thing, too, that when the last snow had melted, when the purple and yellow crocuses were coming up in the garden, and the old church was already half pulled down, Milly had an illness which made her lips look pale, and rendered it absolutely necessary that she should not exert herself for some time. Mr. Brand, the Shepperton doctor so obnoxious to Mr. Pilgrim, ordered her to drink port wine, and it was quite necessary to have a charwoman very often to assist Nanny in all the extra work that fell upon her. Mrs. Hackett, who hardly ever paid a visit to anyone but her oldest and nearest neighbour, Mrs. Patten, now took the unusual step of calling at the vicarage one morning, and the tears came into her unsentimental eyes as she saw Milly seated, pale and feeble, in the parlour, unable to persevere in sewing the pinafore that lay on the table beside her. Little Dicky, a boisterous boy of 5, with large pink cheeks and sturdy legs, was having his turn to sit with Mamma, and was squatting, quiet as a mouse, at her knee, holding her soft white hand between his little red, black-nailed fists. He was a boy whom Mrs. Hackett, in a severe mood, had pronounced stocky, a word that etymologically, in all probability, conveys some allusion to an instrument of punishment for the refractory. But seeing him thus subdued into goodness, she smiled at him with her kindest smile, and, stooping down, suggested a kiss, a favour which Dicky resolutely declined. "Now, do you take nourishing things enough?" was one of Mrs. Hackett's first questions, and Milly endeavoured to make it appear that no woman was ever so much in danger of being overfed and led into self-indulgent habits as herself. But Mrs. Hackett gathered one fact from her replies, namely, that Mr. Brand had ordered port wine. While this conversation was going forward, Dicky had been furtively stroking and kissing the soft white hand, so that at last, when a pause came, his mother said smilingly, "Why are you kissing my hand, Dicky?" "It is so lovely," answered Dicky, who, you observe, was decidedly backward in pronunciation. Mrs. Hackett remembered this little scene in after days, and thought with peculiar tenderness and pity of the stocky boy. The next day there came a hamper with Mrs. Hackett's respects, and on being opened it was found to contain 6 of port wine and 2 couples of fowls. Mrs. Farquhar, too, was very kind, insisted on Mrs. Barton's rejecting all arrowroot but hers, which was genuine Indian, and carried away Sophie and Fred to stay with her a fortnight. These and other good-natured attentions made the trouble of Milly's illness more bearable, but they could not prevent it from swelling expenses, and Mr. Barton began to have serious thoughts of representing his case to a certain charity for the relief of needy curates. Altogether, as matters stood in Shepperton, the parishioners were more likely to have a strong sense that the clergyman needed their material aid than that they needed his spiritual aid. Not the best state of things in this age and country, where faith in men solely on the ground of their spiritual gifts has considerably diminished, and especially unfavourable to the influence of the Reverend Amos, whose spiritual gifts would not have had a very commanding power even in an age of faith. But, you ask, did not the Countess Czerlaski pay any attention to her friends all this time? To be sure she did. She was indefatigable in visiting her sweet Milly, and sitting with her for hours together. It may seem remarkable to you that she neither thought of taking away any of the children, nor of providing for any of Milly's probable wants. But ladies of rank and of luxurious habits, you know, cannot be expected to surmise the details of poverty. She put a great deal of eau de cologne on Mrs. Barton's pocket-handkerchief, rearranged her pillow and footstool, kissed her cheeks, wrapped her in a soft, warm shawl from her own shoulders, and amused her with stories of the life she had seen abroad. When Mr. Barton joined them, she talked of Tractarianism, of her determination not to re-enter the vortex of fashionable life, and of her anxiety to see him in a sphere large enough for his talents. Milly thought her sprightliness and affectionate warmth quite charming, and was very fond of her, while the Reverend Amos had a vague consciousness that he had risen into aristocratic life, and only associated with his middle-class parishioners in a pastoral and parenthetic manner. However, as the days brightened, Milly's cheeks and lips brightened too, and in a few weeks she was almost as active as ever, though watchful eyes might have seen that activity was not easy to her. Mrs. Hackett's eyes were of that kind, and one day, when Mr. and Mrs. Barton had been dining with her for the first time since Milly's illness, she observed to her husband, "That poor thing's dreadful weak and delicate. She won't stand having many more children."
Mr. Barton, meanwhile, had been indefatigable in his vocation. He had preached 2 extemporary sermons every Sunday at the workhouse, where a room had been fitted up for divine service pending the alterations in the church, and had walked the same evening to a cottage at one or other extremity of his parish to deliver another sermon, still more extemporary, in an atmosphere impregnated with spring flowers and perspiration. After all these labours, you will easily conceive that he was considerably exhausted by 9:30 in the evening, and that a supper at a friendly parishioner's, with a glass or even 2 glasses of brandy and water after it, was a welcome reinforcement. Mr. Barton was not at all an ascetic. He thought the benefits of fasting were entirely confined to the Old Testament dispensation. He was fond of relaxing himself with a little gossip. Indeed, Miss Bond and other ladies of enthusiastic views sometimes regretted that Mr. Barton did not more uninterruptedly exhibit a superiority to the things of the flesh. Thin ladies who take little exercise and whose livers are not strong enough to bear stimulants are so extremely critical about one's personal habits. And after all, the Reverend Amos never came near the borders of a vice. His very faults were middling. He was not very ungrammatical. It was not in his nature to be superlative in anything, unless, indeed, he was superlatively middling, the quintessential extract of mediocrity. If there was any one point on which he showed an inclination to be excessive, it was confidence in his own shrewdness and ability in practical matters, so that he was very full of plans which were something like his moves in chess, admirably well calculated, supposing the state of the case were otherwise. For example, that notable plan of introducing anti-dissenting books into his lending library did not in the least appear to have bruised the head of dissent, though it had certainly made dissent strongly inclined to bite the Reverend Amos's heel. Again, he vexed the souls of his churchwardens and influential parishioners by his fertile suggestiveness as to what it would be well for them to do in the matter of the church repairs and other ecclesiastical secularities. "I never saw the like to parsons," Mr. Hackett said one day in conversation with his brother churchwarden, Mr. Bond. "They're allays for meddling with business, and they know no more about it than my black filly." "Ah," said Mr. Bond, "they're too high-learned to have much common sense." "Well," remarked Mr. Hackett, in a modest and dubious tone, as if throwing out a hypothesis which might be considered bold, "I should say that's a bad sort of education as makes folks unreasonable." So that you perceive Mr. Barton's popularity was in that precarious condition, in that toppling and contingent state, in which a very slight push from a malignant destiny would utterly upset it. That push was not long in being given, as you shall hear. One fine May morning, when Amos was out on his parochial visits, and the sunlight was streaming through the bow window of the sitting-room, where Milly was seated at her sewing, occasionally looking up to glance at the children playing in the garden, there came a loud rap at the door, which she at once recognised as the Countess's, and that well-dressed lady presently entered the sitting-room with her veil drawn over her face. Milly was not at all surprised or sorry to see her, but when the Countess threw up her veil and showed that her eyes were red and swollen, she was both surprised and sorry. "What can be the matter, dear Caroline?" Caroline threw down Jet, who gave a little yelp. Then she threw her arms round Milly's neck and began to sob. Then she threw herself on the sofa and begged for a glass of water. Then she threw off her bonnet and shawl, and by the time Milly's imagination had exhausted itself in conjuring up calamities, she said, "Dear, how shall I tell you? I am the most wretched woman. To be deceived by a brother to whom I have been so devoted, to see him degrading himself, giving himself utterly to the dogs." "What can it be?" said Milly, who began to picture to herself the sober Mr. Bridmain taking to brandy and betting. "He is going to be married, to marry my own maid, that deceitful Alice, to whom I have been the most indulgent mistress. Did you ever hear of anything so disgraceful? So mortifying, so disreputable? "And has he only just told you of it?" said Milly, who, having really heard of worse conduct, even in her innocent life, avoided a direct answer. "Told me of it! He had not even the grace to do that. I went into the dining-room suddenly and found him kissing her. Disgusting at his time of life, is it not? And when I reproved her for allowing such liberties, she turned round saucily and said she was engaged to be married to my brother, and she saw no shame in allowing him to kiss her. Edmund is a miserable coward, you know, and looked frightened, but when she asked him to say whether it was not so, he tried to summon up courage and say yes. I left the room in disgust, and this morning I have been questioning Edmund, and find that he is bent on marrying this woman, and that he has been putting off telling me, because he was ashamed of himself, I suppose. I couldn't possibly stay in the house after this, with my own maid turned mistress. And now, Milly, I'm come to throw myself on your charity for a week or two. Will you take me in?" "That we will," said Milly. "If you will only put up with our poor rooms and way of living, it will be delightful to have you." "It will soothe me to be with you, Mr. Barton, a little while. I feel quite unable to go among my other friends just at present. What those two wretched people will do, I don't know. Leave the neighbourhood at once, I hope. I entreated my brother to do so before he disgraced himself." When Amos came home, he joined his cordial welcome and sympathy to Milly's. By and by the Countess's formidable boxes, which she had carefully packed before her indignation drove her away from Camp Villa, arrived at the vicarage and were deposited in the spare bedroom, and in 2 closets, not spare, which Milly emptied for their reception. A week afterwards, the excellent apartments at Camp Villa, comprising dining and drawing-rooms, 3 bedrooms and a dressing-room, were again to let, and Mr. Bridmain's sudden departure, together with the Countess Czerlaski's installation as a visitor at Shepperton Vicarage, became a topic of general conversation in the neighbourhood. The keen-sighted virtue of Milby and Shepperton saw in all this a confirmation of its worst suspicions, and pitied the Reverend Amos Barton's gullibility. But when week after week and month after month slipped by without witnessing the Countess's departure, when summer and harvest had fled and still left her behind them, occupying the spare bedroom and the closets, and also a large proportion of Mrs. Barton's time and attention, new surmises of a very evil kind were added to the old rumours, and began to take the form of settled convictions in the minds even of Mr. Barton's most friendly parishioners. And now here is an opportunity for an accomplished writer to apostrophize calumny, to quote Virgil, and to show that he is acquainted with the most ingenious things which have been said on that subject in polite literature. But what is opportunity to the man who can't use it? An undefecundated egg, which the waves of time wash away into nonentity. So, as my memory is ill-furnished, and my notebook still worse, I am unable to show myself either erudite or eloquent apropos of the calumny whereof the Reverend Amos Barton was the victim. I can only ask my reader, did you ever upset your ink-bottle and watch in helpless agony the rapid spread of Stygian blackness over your fair manuscript or fairer table-cover? With a like inky swiftness did gossip now blacken the reputation of the Reverend Amos Barton, causing the unfriendly to scorn, and even the friendly to stand aloof, at a time when difficulties of another kind were fast thickening around him. Chapter 6. One November morning, at least 6 months after the Countess Czerlaski had taken up her residence at the vicarage, Mrs. Hackett heard that her neighbour Mrs. Patten had an attack of her old complaint, vaguely called the spasms. Accordingly, about 11 o'clock, she put on her velvet bonnet and cloth cloak, with a long boa and muff large enough to stow a prize baby in, for Mrs. Hackett regulated her costume by the calendar, and brought out her furs on the 1st of November, whatever might be the temperature. She was not a woman weakly to accommodate herself to shilly-shally proceedings. If the season didn't know what it ought to do, Mrs. Hackett did. In her best days it was always sharp weather at Gunpowder Plot, and she didn't like new fashions. And this morning the weather was very rationally in accordance with her costume, for as she made her way through the fields to Cross Farm, the yellow leaves on the hedge-girt elms, which showed bright and golden against the long hanging purple clouds, were being scattered across the grassy path by the coldest of November winds. "Ah," Mrs. Hackett thought to herself, "I dare say we shall have a sharp pinch this winter, and if we do, I shouldn't wonder if it takes the old lady off. They say a green Yule makes a fat churchyard, but so does a white Yule too, for that matter, when the stool's rotten enough, no matter who sits on it." However, on her arrival at Cross Farm, the prospect of Mrs. Patton's decease was again thrown into the dim distance in her imagination, for Miss Janet Gibbs met her with the news that Mrs. Patton was much better, and led her, without any preliminary announcement, to the old lady's bedroom. Janet had scarcely reached the end of her circumstantial narrative, how the attack came on and what were her aunt's sensations, a narrative to which Mrs. Patton, in her neatly plaited nightcap, seemed to listen with a contemptuous resignation to her niece's historical inaccuracy, contenting herself with occasionally confounding Janet by a shake of the head, when the clatter of a horse's hoofs on the yard pavement announced the arrival of Mr. Pilgrim, whose large, top-booted person presently made its appearance upstairs. He found Mrs. Patton going on so well that there was no need to look solemn. He might glide from condolence into gossip without offence, and the temptation of having Mrs. Hackett's ear was irresistible. "What a disgraceful business this is turning out of your parsons," was the remark with which he made this agreeable transition, throwing himself back in the chair from which he had been leaning towards the patient. "Eh, dear me," said Mrs. Hackett, "disgraceful enough. I stuck to Mr. Barton as long as I could for his wife's sake, but I can't countenance such goings-on. It's hateful to see that woman coming with him to service of a Sunday, and if Mr. Hackett wasn't churchwarden and I didn't think it wrong to forsake one's own parish, I should go to Nepley Church. There's a many parishioners as do." "I used to think Barton was only a fool," observed Mr. Pilgrim, in a tone which implied that he was conscious of having been weakly charitable. "I thought he was imposed upon and led away by those people when they first came. Oh, but that's impossible now." "Oh, it's as plain as the nose in your face," said Mrs. Hackett unreflectingly, not perceiving the equivocy in her comparison. "Coming to Milby like a sparrow perching on a bough, as I may say, with her brother, as she called him, and then all on a sudden the brother goes off with himself, and she throws herself on the Bartons. Though what could make her take up with a poor notomise of a parson as hasn't got enough to keep wife and children, there's one above knows, I don't." "Mr. Barton may have attractions we don't know of," said Mr. Pilgrim, who piqued himself on a talent for sarcasm. "The Countess has no maid now, and they say Mr. Barton is handy in assisting at her toilette, laces her boots, and so forth." "Till it be fiddled," said Mrs. Hackett with indignant boldness of metaphor. "And there's that poor thing a-sewing her fingers to the bone for them children, and another coming on. What she must have to go through! It goes to my heart to turn my back on her, but she's i' the wrong to let herself be put upon in that manner." "Ah, I was talking to Mrs. Farquhar about that the other day. She said, 'I think Mrs. Barton a very weak woman.'" Mr. Pilgrim gave this quotation with slow emphasis, as if he thought Mrs. Farquhar had uttered a remarkable sentiment. "They find it impossible to invite her to their house while she has that equivocal person staying with her." "Well," remarked Miss Gibbs, "if I was a wife, nothing should induce me to bear what Mrs. Barton does." "Yes, it's fine talking," said Mrs. Patton from her pillow. "Old maids' husbands are allers well managed. If you was a wife, you'd be as foolish as your betters, belike." "All my wonder is," observed Mrs. Hackett, "how the Bartons make both ends meet. You may depend on it she's got nothing to give 'em, for I understand as he's been having money from some clergy charity. They said at Foster she stuffed Mr. Barton with notions about her writing to the Chancellor and her fine friends to give him a living. However, I don't know what's true and what's false. Mr. Barton keeps away from our house now, for I give him a bit of my mind one day. Maybe he's ashamed of himself. He seems to me to look dreadful thin and harassed of a Sunday." "Oh, he must be aware he's getting into bad odour everywhere. The clergy are quite disgusted with his folly. They say Carp would be glad to get Barton out of the curacy if he could. But he can't do that without coming to Shepperton himself, as Barton's a licensed curate, and he wouldn't like that, I suppose."
At this moment Mrs. Patten showed signs of uneasiness, which recalled Mr. Pilgrim to professional attentions, and Mrs. Hackett, observing that it was Thursday and she must see after the butter, said good-bye, promising to look in again soon and bring her knitting. This Thursday, by the by, is the first in the month, the day on which the clerical meeting is held at Milby Vicarage, and as the Reverend Amos Barton has reasons for not attending, he will very likely be a subject of conversation among his clerical brethren. Suppose we go there and hear whether Mr. Pilgrim has reported their opinion correctly. There is not a numerous party today, for it is a season of sore throats and catarrhs, so that the exegetical and theological discussions, which are the preliminary of dining, have not been quite so spirited as usual. And although a question relative to the Epistle of Jude has not been quite cleared up, the striking of 6 by the church clock and the simultaneous announcement of dinner are sounds that no one feels to be importunate. Pleasant, when one is not in the least bilious, to enter a comfortable dining-room where the closely drawn red curtains glow with the double light of fire and candle, where glass and silver are glittering on the pure damask, and a soup tureen gives a hint of the fragrance that will presently rush out to inundate your hungry senses, and prepare them by the delicate visitation of atoms for the keen gusto of ampler contact. Especially if you have confidence in the dinner-giving capacity of your host, if you know that he is not a man who entertains grovelling views of eating and drinking as a mere satisfaction of hunger and thirst, and, dead to all the finer influences of the palate, expects his guest to be brilliant on ill-flavoured gravies and the cheapest marsala. Mr. Ely was particularly worthy of such confidence, and his virtues as an amphitryon had probably contributed quite as much as the central situation of Milby to the selection of his house as a clerical rendezvous. He looks particularly graceful at the head of his table, and indeed on all occasions where he acts as president or moderator, he is a man who seems to listen well and is an excellent amalgam of dissimilar ingredients. At the other end of the table, as vice, sits Mr. Fellows, rector and magistrate, a man of imposing appearance, with a mellifluous voice and the readiest of tongues. Mr. Fellows once obtained a living by the persuasive charms of his conversation, and the fluency with which he interpreted the opinions of an obese and stammering baronet, so as to give that elderly gentleman a very pleasing perception of his own wisdom. Mr. Fellows is a very successful man, and has the highest character everywhere, except in his own parish, where, doubtless because his parishioners happen to be quarrelsome people, he is always at fierce feud with a farmer or two, a colliery proprietor, a grocer who was once churchwarden, and a tailor who formerly officiated as clerk. At Mr. Ely's right hand you see a very small man with a sallow and somewhat puffy face, whose hair is brushed straight up, evidently with the intention of giving him a height somewhat less disproportionate to his sense of his own importance than the measure of 5'3" accorded him by an oversight of nature. This is Reverend Archibald Duke, a very dyspeptic and evangelical man, who takes the gloomiest view of mankind and their prospects, and thinks the immense sale of the Pickwick papers, recently completed, one of the strongest proofs of original sin. Unfortunately, though Mr. Duke was not burdened with a family, his yearly expenditure was apt considerably to exceed his income, and the unpleasant circumstances resulting from this, together with heavy meat breakfasts, may probably have contributed to his desponding views of the world generally. Next to him is seated Mr. Furness, a tall young man with blonde hair and whiskers, who was plucked at Cambridge entirely owing to his genius. At least I know that he soon afterwards published a volume of poems, which were considered remarkably beautiful by many young ladies of his acquaintance. Mr. Furness preached his own sermons, as anyone of tolerable critical acumen might have certified by comparing them with his poems. In both there was an exuberance of metaphor and simile entirely original, and not in the least borrowed from any resemblance in the things compared. On Mr. Furness's left you see Mr. Pugh, another young curate of much less marked characteristics. He had not published any poems. He had not even been plucked. He had neat black whiskers and a pale complexion, read prayers and a sermon twice every Sunday, and might be seen any day sallying forth on his parochial duties in a white tie, a well-brushed hat, a perfect suit of black, and well-polished boots, an equipment which he probably supposed hieroglyphically to represent the spirit of Christianity to the parishioners of Whittlecombe. Mr. Pugh's vis-à-vis is the Reverend Martin Cleves, a man about 40, middle-sized, broad-shouldered, with a negligently tied cravat, large irregular features, and a large head thickly covered with lanky brown hair. To a superficial glance, Mr. Cleves is the plainest and least clerical-looking of the party. Yet, strange to say, there is the true parish priest, the pastor beloved, consulted, relied on by his flock. A clergyman who is not associated with the undertaker, but thought of as the surest helper under a difficulty, as a monitor who is encouraging rather than severe. Mr. Cleves has the wonderful art of preaching sermons which the wheelwright and the blacksmith can understand, not because he talks condescending twaddle, but because he can call a spade, and knows how to disencumber ideas of their wordy frippery. Look at him more attentively, and you will see that his face is a very interesting one, that there is a great deal of humour and feeling playing in his grey eyes and about the corners of his roughly cut mouth. A man, you observe, who is most likely sprung from the harder-working section of the middle class, and has hereditary sympathies with the checkered life of the people. He gets together the working men in his parish on a Monday evening, and gives them a sort of conversational lecture on useful practical matters, telling them stories or reading some select passages from an agreeable book, and commenting on them. And if you were to ask the first labourer or artisan in Triplegate what sort of man the parson was, he would say, "Uncommon knowing, sensible, free-spoken gentleman, very kind and good-natured, too." Yet for all this he is perhaps the best Grecian of the party, if we except Mr. Baird, the young man on his left. Mr. Baird has since gained considerable celebrity as an original writer and metropolitan lecturer, but at that time he used to preach in a little church something like a barn, to a congregation consisting of 3 rich farmers and their servants, about 15 labourers, and the due proportion of women and children. The rich farmers understood him to be very high-learnt, but if you had interrogated them for a more precise description, they would have said that he was a thinnish-faced man with a sort of cast in his eye like. 7 altogether. A delightful number for a dinner party, supposing the units to be delightful, but everything depends on that. During dinner Mr. Fellows took the lead in the conversation, which set strongly in the direction of mangel wurzel and the rotation of crops, for Mr. Fellows and Mr. Cleves cultivated their own glebes. Mr. Ely, too, had some agricultural notions, and even the Reverend Archibald Duke was made alive to that class of mundane subjects by the possession of some potato ground. The 2 young curates talked a little aside during these discussions, which had imperfect interest for their unbeneficed minds, and the transcendental and near-sighted Mr. Baird seemed to listen somewhat abstractedly, knowing little more of potatoes and mangel wurzel than that they were some form of the conditioned. "What a hobby farming is with Lord Watling," said Mr. Fellows when the cloth was being drawn. "I went over his farm at Tetterley with him last summer. It is really a model farm. First-rate dairy, grazing and wheatland, and such splendid farm buildings. An expensive hobby, though. He sinks a good deal of money there, I fancy. He has a great whim for black cattle, and he sends that drunken old Scotch bailiff of his to Scotland every year with hundreds in his pocket to buy these beasts." "By the by," said Mr. Ely, "do you know who is the man to whom Lord Watling has given the Bramhill living?" "A man named Sargent. I knew him at Oxford. His brother is a lawyer, and was very useful to Lord Watling in that ugly Brownsell affair. That's why Sargent got the living." "Sargent," said Mr. Ely. "I know him. Isn't he a showy, talkative fellow?"
has written Travels in Mesopotamia or something of that sort. That's the man. He was at Witherington once as Bagshaw's curate. He got into rather bad odour there through some scandal about a flirtation, I think."
"Talking of scandal," returned Mr. Fellows, "have you heard the last story about Barton? Nisbet was telling me the other day that he dines alone with the Countess at 6, while Mrs. Barton is in the kitchen acting as cook."
"Rather an apocryphal authority, Nisbet," said Mr. Ely.
"Ah," said Mr. Cleves, with good-natured humour twinkling in his eyes, "depend upon it, that is a corrupt version. The original text is that they all dine together with 6, meaning 6 children, and that Mrs. Barton is an excellent cook." "I wish dining alone together may be the worst of that sad business," said the Reverend Archibald Cook, in a tone implying that his wish was a strong figure of speech. "Well," said Mr. Fellows, filling his glass and looking jocose, "Barton is certain either the greatest gull in existence, or he has some cunning secret, some filter or other, to make himself charming in the eyes of a fair lady. It isn't all of us that can make conquest when our ugliness is past its bloom."
"The lady seemed to have made a conquest of him at the very outset," said Mr. Ely. "I was immensely amused one night at Granby's when he was telling us her story about her husband's adventures. He said, 'When she told me the tale, I felt I don't know how. I felt it from the crown of my head to the sole of my feet.'" Mr. Ely gave these words dramatically, imitating the Reverend Amos's fervour and symbolic action, and everyone laughed except Mr. Duke, whose after-dinner view of things was not apt to be jovial. He said, "I think some of us ought to remonstrate with Mr. Barton on the scandal he is causing. He is not only imperilling his own soul, but the souls of his flock." "Depend upon it," said Mr. Cleves, "there is some simple explanation of the whole affair, if we only happen to know it. Barton has always impressed me as a right-minded man who has the knack of doing himself injustice by his manner." "Now, I never liked Barton," said Mr. Fellows. "He's not a gentleman. Why, he used to be on terms of intimacy with that canting prior who died a little while ago, a fellow who soaked himself with spirits and talked of the gospel through an inflamed nose. The Countess has given him more refined tastes, I dare say," said Mr. Ely. "Well," observed Mr. Cleves, "the poor fellow must have a hard pull to get along, with his small income and large family. Let us hope the Countess does something towards making the pot boil." "Not she," said Mr. Duke. "There are greater signs of poverty about them than ever." "Well, come," returned Mr. Cleves, who could be caustic sometimes, and who was not at all fond of his reverend brother, Mr. Duke. "That's something in Barton's favour, at all events. He might be poor without showing signs of poverty." Mr. Duke turned rather yellow, which was his way of blushing, and Mr. Ely came to his relief by observing, "They are making a very good piece of work of Shepperton Church. Dolby, the architect who has it in hand, is a very clever fellow." "It's he who has been doing Coppleton Church," said Mr. Furness. "They've got it in excellent order for the Visitation." This mention of the Visitation suggested the bishop, and thus opened a wide duct which entirely diverted the stream of animadversion from that small pipe, that capillary vessel, the Reverend Amos Barton. The talk of the clergy about their bishop belongs to the esoteric part of their profession, so we will at once quit the dining-room at Milby Vicarage, lest we should happen to overhear remarks unsuited to the lay understanding, and perhaps dangerous to our repose of mind. Chapter 7. I dare say the long residence of the Countess Czerlaski at Shepperton Vicarage is very puzzling to you also, dear reader, as well as to Mr. Barton's clerical brethren. The more so as I hope you are not in the least inclined to put that very evil interpretation on it, which evidently found acceptance with the sallow and dyspeptic Mr. Duke, and with the florid and highly peptic Mr. Fellows. You have seen enough, I trust, of the Reverend Amos Barton to be convinced that he was more apt to fall into a blunder than into a sin, more apt to be deceived than to incur a necessity for being deceitful. And if you have a keen eye for physiognomy, you will have detected that the Countess Czerlaski loved herself far too well to get entangled in an unprofitable vice.
How then, you will say, could this fine lady choose to quarter herself on the establishment of a poor curate, where the carpets were probably falling into holes, where the attendance was limited to a maid-of-all-work, and where 6 children were running loose from 8 o'clock in the morning till 8 o'clock in the evening? Surely you must be straining probability. Heaven forbid! For not having a lofty imagination, as you perceive, and being unable to invent thrilling incidents for your amusement, my only merit must lie in the truth with which I represent to you the humble experience of ordinary fellow mortals. I wish to stir your sympathy with commonplace troubles, to win your tears for real sorrow such as may live next door to you, such as walks neither in rags nor in velvet, but in very ordinary decent apparel. Therefore, that you may dismiss your suspicions as to the truth of my picture, I will beg you to consider that at the time the Countess Czerlaski left Camp Villa in dudgeon, she had only £20 in her pocket, being about 1/3 of the income she possessed independently of her brother. You will then perceive that she was in the extremely inconvenient predicament of having quarrelled, not indeed with her bread and cheese, but certainly with her chicken and tart, a predicament all the more inconvenient to her because the habit of idleness had quite unfitted her for earning those necessary superfluities, and because, with all her fascinations, she had not secured any enthusiastic friends whose houses were open to her and who were dying to see her. Thus she had completely checkmated herself, unless she could resolve on one unpleasant move, namely to humble herself to her brother and recognize his wife. This seemed quite impossible to her, as long as she entertained the hope that he would make the first advances, and in this flattering hope she remained month after month at Shepperton Vicarage, gracefully overlooking the deficiencies of accommodation and feeling that she was really behaving charmingly. Who, indeed, she thought to herself, could do otherwise with a lovely, gentle creature like Milly? I shall really be sorry to leave the poor thing. So, though she lay in bed till 10, and came down to a separate breakfast at 11, she kindly consented to dine as early as 5, when a hot joint was prepared, which coldly furnished forth the children's table the next day. She considerately prevented Milly from devoting herself too closely to the children by insisting on reading, talking, and walking with her, and she even began to embroider a cap for the next baby, which must certainly be a girl and be named Caroline. After the first month or two of her residence at the vicarage, the Reverend Amos Barton became aware, as indeed it was unavoidable that he should, of the strong disapprobation it drew upon him, and the change of feeling towards him which it was producing in his kindest parishioners. But, in the first place, he still believed in the Countess as a charming and influential woman, disposed to befriend him, and in any case he could hardly hint departure to a lady guest who had been kind to him and his, and who might any day spontaneously announce the termination of her visit. In the second place, he was conscious of his own innocence, and felt some contemptuous indignation towards people who were ready to imagine evil of him. And lastly, he had, as I have already intimated, a strong will of his own, so that a certain obstinacy and defiance mingled itself with his other feelings on the subject. The one unpleasant consequence which was not to be evaded or counteracted by any mere mental state was the increasing drain on his slender purse for household expenses, to meet which the remittance he had received from the clerical charity threatened to be quite inadequate. Slander may be defeated by equanimity, but courageous thoughts will not pay your baker's bill, and fortitude is nowhere considered legal tender for beef. Month after month the financial aspect of the Reverend Amos's affairs became more and more serious to him, and month after month, too, wore away more and more of that armour of indignation and defiance with which he had at first defended himself from the harsh looks of faces that were once the friendliest. But quite the heaviest pressure of the trouble fell on Milly, on gentle, uncomplaining Milly, whose delicate body was becoming daily less fit for all the many things that had to be done between rising up and lying down. At first she thought the Countess's visit would not last long, and she was quite glad to incur extra exertion for the sake of making her friend comfortable. I can hardly bear to think of all the rough work she did with those lovely hands, all by the sly, without letting her husband know anything about it, and husbands are not clairvoyant. How she salted bacon, ironed shirts and cravats, put patches on patches, and redarned darns. Then there was the task of mending and eking out baby linen in prospect, and the problem perpetually suggesting itself how she and Nanny should manage when there was another baby, as there would be before very many months were past. When time glided on and the Countess's visit did not end, Milly was not blind to any phase of their position. She knew of the slander, she was aware of the keeping aloof of old friends, but these she felt almost entirely on her husband's account. A loving woman's world lies within the four walls of her own home, and it is only through her husband that she is in any electric communication with the world beyond. Mrs. Simpkins may have looked scornfully at her, but baby crows and holds out his little arms none the less blithely. Mrs. Tomkins may have left off calling on her, but her husband comes home none the less to receive her care and caresses. It has been wet and gloomy out of doors to-day, but she has looked well after the shirt-buttons, has cut out baby's pinafores, and half-finished Willie's blouse. So it was with Milly. She was only vexed that her husband should be vexed, only wounded because he was misconceived. But the difficulty about ways and means she felt in quite a different manner. Her rectitude was alarmed lest they should have to make tradesmen wait for their money. Her motherly love dreaded the diminution of comforts for the children, and the sense of her own failing health gave exaggerated force to these fears. Milly could no longer shut her eyes to the fact that the Countess was inconsiderate, if she did not allow herself to entertain severer thoughts, and she began to feel that it would soon be a duty to tell her frankly that they really could not afford to have her visit farther prolonged. But a process was going forward in two other minds, which ultimately saved Milly from having to perform this painful task. In the first place, the Countess was getting weary of Shepperton, weary of waiting for her brother's overtures which never came. So one fine morning she reflected that forgiveness was a Christian duty, that a sister should be placable, that Mr. Bridmain must feel the need of her advice, to which he had been accustomed for 3 years, and that very likely that woman didn't make the poor man happy. In this amiable frame of mind she wrote a very affectionate appeal, and addressed it to Mr. Bridmain through his banker. Another mind that was being wrought up to a climax was Nanny's, the maid-of-all-work, who had a warm heart and a still warmer temper. Nanny adored her mistress. She had been heard to say that she was ready to kiss the ground as a mistress trod on, and Walter, she considered, was her baby, of whom she was as jealous as a lover. But she had from the first very slight admiration for the Countess Czerlaski. That lady, from Nanny's point of view, was a personage always drawed out of fine clothes, the chief result of whose existence was to cause additional bed-making, carrying of hot water, laying of tablecloths, and cooking of dinners. It was a perpetually heightening aggravation to Nanny that she and her mistress had to slave more than ever because there was this fine lady in the house. "And she pays nothing for it, neither," observed Nanny to Mr. Jacob Toms, a young gentleman in the tailoring line, who occasionally, simply out of a taste for dialogue, looked into the vicarage kitchen of an evening. "I know the master's shorter of money than ever, and it makes no end of difference in the housekeeping, being here, besides being obliged to have a charwoman constant." "There's fine stories in the village about her," said Mr. Toms. "They says Muster Barton's great wi' her, or else she'd never stop here." "Then they say a passel of lies, and you ought to be ashamed to go and tell 'em o'er again. Do you think as the master, as has got a wife like the missus, a go running after a stuck-up piece of goods like that Countess, as isn't fit to black the missis's shoes? I'm none so fond of the master, but I know better on him nor that." "Well, I didn't believe it," said Mr. Toms humbly. "Believe it? You'd have been a ninny if you did. And she's a nasty stingy thing, that Countess. She's never give me a sixpence nor an old rag neither since she's been. A lying abed and a coming down to breakfast when other folks wants their dinner." If such was the state of Nanny's mind as early as the end of August, when this dialogue with Mr. Toms occurred, You may imagine what it must have been by the beginning of November, and that at that time a very slight spark might any day cause the long smouldering anger to flame forth in open indignation. That spark happened to fall the very morning that Mrs. Hackett paid the visit to Mrs. Patten recorded in the last chapter. Nanny's dislike of the Countess extended to the innocent dog Jet, whom she couldn't bear to see made a fuss wi' like a Christian, and the little ousel must be washed, too, every Saturday, as if there wasn't children in who to wash without washing dogs. Now, this particular morning it happened that Milly was quite too poorly to get up, and Mr. Barton observed to Nanny on going out that he would call and tell Mr. Brand to come. These circumstances were already enough to make Nanny anxious and susceptible, but the Countess, comfortably ignorant of them, came down as usual about 11 o'clock to her separate breakfast, which stood ready for her at that hour in the parlour, the kettle singing on the hob that she might make her own tea. There was a little jug of cream, taken according to custom from last night's milk, and specially saved for the Countess's breakfast. Jet always awaited his mistress at her bedroom door, and it was her habit to carry him downstairs. "Now, my little Jet," she said, putting him down gently on the hearthrug, "you shall have a nice breakfast." Jet indicated that he thought that observation extremely pertinent and well-timed by immediately raising himself on his hind legs, and the Countess emptied the cream jug into the saucer. Now there was usually a small jug of milk standing on the tray by the side of the cream and destined for Jet's breakfast, but this morning Nanny, being moithered, had forgotten that part of the arrangements, so that when the Countess had made her tea she perceived there was no second jug and rang the bell. Nanny appeared, looking very red and heated. The fact was she'd been doing up the kitchen fire, and that is a sort of work which by no means conduces to blandness of temper. "Nanny, you've forgotten Jet's milk. Will you bring me some more cream, please?" This was just a little too much for Nanny's forbearance. "Yes, I dare say. Here am I with my hands full of the children and the dinner, and Mrs. Illabed and Mr. Brand are coming, and I must run o'er the village to get more cream, 'cause you've given it to that nasty little blackamoor." "Is Mrs. Barton ill?" "Ill? Yes, I should think she is ill. How much you care? She's likely to be ill, moithered as she is from morning to night, with folks as had better be elsewhere." "What do you mean by behaving in this way?" "Mean? Why, I mean as the missus is a-slaving her life out and sitting up o' nights for folks as are better able to wait of her, instead of lying abed and doing nothing all the blessed day but make work." "Leave the room, and don't be insolent." "Insolent? I'd better be insolent than like what some folks is, a-living on other folks and bringing a bad name on 'em into the bargain." Here Nanny flung out of the room, leaving the lady to digest this unexpected breakfast at her leisure. The Countess was stunned for a few minutes, but when she began to recall Nanny's words, there was no possibility of avoiding very unpleasant conclusions from them, or of failing to see her position at the vicarage in an entirely new light. The interpretation, too, of Nanny's allusion to a bad name did not lie out of the reach of the Countess's imagination, and she saw the necessity of quitting Shepperton without delay. Still, she would like to wait for her brother's letter. No, she would ask Milly to forward it to her. Or still better, she would go at once to London, inquire her brother's address at his banker's, and go to see him without preliminary. She went up to Milly's room, and after kisses and inquiries said, "I find on consideration, dear Milly, from the letter I had yesterday, that I must bid you good-bye and go up to London at once. But you must not let me leave you ill, you naughty thing." "Oh, no," said Milly, who felt as if a load had been taken off her back. "I shall be very well in an hour or two. Indeed, I'm much better now. You will want me to help you to pack. But you won't go for 2 or 3 days." "Yes, I must go tomorrow. But I shall not let you help me to pack, so don't entertain any unreasonable projects, but lie still. Mr. Brand is coming, Nanny says." The news was not an unpleasant surprise to Mr. Barton when he came home, though he was able to express more regret at the idea of parting than Milly could summon to her lips. He retained more of his original feeling for the Countess than Milly did, for women never betray themselves to men as they do to each other, and the Reverend Amos had not a keen instinct for character. But he felt that he was being relieved from a difficulty, and in the way that was easiest for him. Neither he nor Milly suspected that it was Nanny who had cut the knot for them, for the Countess took care to give no sign on that subject. As for Nanny, she was perfectly aware of the relation between cause and effect in the affair, and secretly chuckled over her outburst of sauce as the best morning's work she had ever done. So, on Friday morning, a fly was seen standing at the vicarage gate with the Countess's boxes packed upon it, and presently that lady herself was seen getting into the vehicle. After a last shake of the hand to Mr. Barton, and last kisses to Milly and the children, the door was closed, and as the fly rolled off, the little party at the vicarage gate caught a last glimpse of the handsome Countess leaning back and waving kisses from the carriage window. Jet's little black phiz was also seen, and doubtless he had his thoughts and feelings on the occasion, but he kept them strictly within his own bosom. The schoolmistress opposite witnessed this departure, and lost no time in telling it to the schoolmaster, who again communicated the news to the landlord of the Jolly Colliers at the close of the morning school hours. Nanny poured the joyful tidings into the ear of Mr. Farquhar's footman, who happened to call with a letter, and Mr. Brand carried them to all the patients he visited that morning, after calling on Mrs. Barton. So that before Sunday it was very generally known in Shepperton parish that the Countess Czerlaski had left the vicarage. The Countess had left, but alas, the bills she had contributed to swell still remained. So did the exiguity of the children's clothing, which also was partly an indirect consequence of her presence, and so too did the coolness and alienation in the parishioners, which could not at once vanish before the fact of her departure. The Reverend Amos was not exculpated, the past was not expunged, but what was worse than all, Milly's health gave frequent cause for alarm, and the prospect of baby's birth was overshadowed by more than the usual fears. The birth came prematurely, about 6 weeks after the Countess's departure, but Mr. Brand gave favourable reports to all inquirers on the following day, which was Saturday. On Sunday, after morning service, Mrs. Hackett called at the vicarage to inquire how Mrs. Barton was, and was invited upstairs to see her. Milly lay placid and lovely in her feebleness, and held out her hand to Mrs. Hackett with a beaming smile. It was very pleasant to her to see her old friend unreserved and cordial once more. The 7 months' baby was very tiny and very red, but handsome is that handsome does. He was pronounced to be doing well, and Mrs. Hackett went home, gladdened at heart to think that the perilous hour was over. Chapter 8. The following Wednesday, when Mr. and Mrs. Hackett were seated comfortably by their bright hearth, enjoying the long afternoon afforded by an early dinner, Rachel, the housemaid, came in and said, "If you please, the shepherd says I've heard as Mrs. Barton's was and not expected to live." Mrs. Hackett turned pale, and hurried out to question the shepherd, who, she found, had heard the sad news at an alehouse in the village. Mr. Hackett followed her out, and said, "You'd better have the pony-chaise and go directly." "Yes," said Mrs. Hackett, too much overcome to utter any exclamations. "Rachel, come and help me on with my things." When her husband was wrapping her cloak round her feet in the pony-chaise, she said, "If I don't come home tonight, I shall send back the pony-chaise, and you'll know I'm wanted there." "Yes, yes." It was a bright, frosty day, and by the time Mrs. Hackett arrived at the vicarage, the sun was near its setting. There was a carriage and pair standing at the gate, which she recognised as Dr. Madeley's, the physician from Rotherby. She entered at the kitchen door, that she might avoid knocking and quietly question Nanny. No one was in the kitchen, but passing on she saw the sitting-room door open, and Nanny, with Walter in her arms, removing the knives and forks which had been laid for dinner 3 hours ago. "Master says he can't eat no dinner," was Nanny's first word. "He's never tasted nothing sin yesterday morning but a cup of tea. When was your missus took worse?" "On Monday night. They sent for Dr. Madeley at the middle of the day yesterday, and he's here again now." "Is the baby alive?" "No, it died last night. The children's all at Mrs. Bond's. She come and took 'em away last night, but the master says they must be fetched soon.
He's upstairs now with Dr. Madeley and Mr. Brand." At this moment Mrs. Hackett heard the sound of a heavy, slow foot in the passage, and presently Amos Barton entered, with dry, despairing eyes, haggard and unshaven. He expected to find the sitting-room as he left it, with nothing to meet his eyes but Milly's work-basket in the corner of the sofa and the children's toys overturned in the bow window. But when he saw Mrs. Hackett come towards him with answering sorrow in her face, the pent-up fountain of tears was opened. He threw himself on the sofa, hid his face, and sobbed aloud. "Bear up, Mr. Barton," Mrs. Hackett ventured to say at last. "Bear up for the sake of them dear children." "The children," said Amos, starting up. "They must be sent for. Someone must fetch them. Milly will want to—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but Mrs. Hackett understood him and said, "I'll send the man with the pony carriage for 'em." She went out to give the order and encountered Dr. Madeley and Mr. Brand, who were just going. Mr. Brand said, "I'm very glad to see you're here, Mrs. Hackett. No time must be lost in sending for the children. Mrs. Barton wants to see them." "Do you quite give her up, then?" "She can hardly live through the night. She begged us to tell her how long she had to live, and then asked for the children." The pony carriage was sent, and Mrs. Hackett, returning to Mr. Barton, said she would like to go upstairs now. He went upstairs with her and opened the door. The chamber fronted the west. The sun was just setting, and the red light fell full upon the bed where Milly lay, with the hand of death visibly upon her. The feather bed had been removed, and she lay low on a mattress, with her head slightly raised by pillows. Her long, fair neck seemed to be struggling with a painful effort. Her features were pallid and pinched, and her eyes were closed. There was no one in the room but the nurse and the mistress of the free school, who had come to give her help from the beginning of the change. Amos and Mrs. Hackett stood beside the bed, and Milly opened her eyes. "My darling, Mrs. Hackett has come to see you." Milly smiled and looked at her with that strange, far-off look which belongs to ebbing life. "Are the children coming?" she said painfully. "Yes, they will be here directly." She closed her eyes again. Presently the pony carriage was heard, and Amos, motioning to Mrs. Hackett to follow him, left the room. On their way downstairs, she suggested that the carriage should remain to take them away again afterwards, and Amos assented. There they stood in the melancholy sitting-room, the 5 sweet children from Patty to Chubby, all with their mother's eyes, all except Patty, looking up with a vague fear at their father as he entered. Patty understood the great sorrow that was come upon them, and tried to check her sobs as she heard her papa's footsteps. "My children," said Amos, taking Chubby in his arms, "God is going to take away your dear mamma from us. She wants to see you to say good-bye. You must try to be very good and not cry." He could say no more, but turned round to see if Nanny was there with Walter, and then led the way upstairs, leading Dicky with the other hand. Mrs. Hackett followed with Sophie and Patty, and then came Nanny with Walter and Fred. It seemed as if Milly had heard the little footsteps on the stairs, for when Amos entered her eyes were wide open, eagerly looking towards the door. They all stood by the bedside, Amos nearest to her, holding Chubby and Dicky. But she motioned for Patty to come first, and clasping the poor pale child by the hand, said, "Patty, I'm going away from you. Love your papa. Comfort him and take care of your little brothers and sisters. God will help you." Patty stood perfectly quiet and said, "Yes, mamma." The mother motioned with her pallid lips for the dear child to lean towards her and kiss her, and then Patty's great anguish overcame her, and she burst into sobs. Amos drew her towards him and pressed her head gently to him, while Milly beckoned Fred and Sophie, and said to them more faintly, "Patty will try to be your mamma when I'm gone, my darlings. You will be good and not vex her." They leaned towards her, and she stroked their fair heads and kissed their tear-stained cheeks. They cried because mamma was ill and papa looked so unhappy, but they thought perhaps next week things would be as they used to be again. The little ones were lifted on the bed to kiss her.
Little Walter said, "Mama, Mama," and stretched out his fat arms and smiled, and Chubby seemed gravely wondering. But Dicky, who had been looking fixedly at her with lip hanging down ever since he came into the room, now seemed suddenly pierced with the idea that Mamma was going away somewhere. His little heart swelled, and he cried aloud. Then Mrs. Hackett and Nanny took them all away. Patty at first begged to stay at home and not go to Mrs. Bond's again, but when Nanny reminded her that she had better go to take care of the younger ones, she submitted at once, and they were all packed in the pony carriage once more. Milly kept her eyes shut for some time after the children were gone. Amos had sunk on his knees and was holding her hand while he watched her face. By and by she opened her eyes, and drawing him close to her, whispered slowly, "My dear, dear husband, you have been very good to me. You have made me very happy." She spoke no more for many hours. They watched her breathing becoming more and more difficult, until evening deepened into night, and until midnight was past. About 12:30 she seemed to be trying to speak, and they leaned to catch her words. "Music! Music! Didn't you hear it?" Amos knelt by the bed and held her hand in his. He did not believe in his sorrow. It was a bad dream. He did not know when she was gone. But Mr. Brand, whom Mrs. Hackett had sent for before 12 o'clock, thinking that Mr. Barton might probably need his help, now came up to him and said, "She feels no more pain now. Come, my dear sir, come with me." "She isn't dead?" shrieked the poor desolate man, struggling to shake off Mr. Brand, who had taken him by the arm. But his weary, weakened frame was not equal to resistance, and he was dragged out of the room. Chapter 9. They laid her in the grave, the sweet mother with her baby in her arms, while the Christmas snow lay thick upon the graves. It was Mr. Cleves who buried her. On the first news of Mr. Barton's calamity, he had ridden over from Triplegate to beg that he might be made of some use, and his silent grasp of Amos's hand had penetrated like the painful thrill of life-recovering warmth to the poor benumbed heart of the stricken man. The snow lay thick upon the graves, and the day was cold and dreary, but there was many a sad eye watching that black procession as it passed from the vicarage to the church, and from the church to the open grave. There were men and women standing in that churchyard who had bandied vulgar jests about their pastor, and who had lightly charged him with sin. But now, when they saw him following the coffin, pale and haggard, he was consecrated anew by his great sorrow, and they looked at him with respectful pity. All the children were there, for Amos had willed it so, thinking that some dim memory of that sacred moment might remain even with little Walter, and link itself with what he would hear of his sweet mother in after years. He himself led Patty and Dicky, then came Sophie and Fred. Mr. Brand had begged to carry Chubby, and Nanny followed with Walter. They made a circle round the grave while the coffin was being lowered. Patty alone of all the children felt that Mamma was in that coffin, and that a new and sadder life had begun for Papa and herself. She was pale and trembling, but she clasped his hand more firmly as the coffin went down, and gave no sob. Fred and Sophie, though they were only 2 and 3 years younger, and though they had seen Mamma in her coffin, seemed to themselves to be looking at some strange show. They had not learned to decipher that terrible handwriting of human destiny, illness and death. Dicky had rebelled against his black clothes, until he was told that it would be naughty to Mamma not to put them on, when he had once submitted. And now, though he had heard Nanny say that Mamma was in heaven, he had a vague notion that she would come home again tomorrow, and say he had been a good boy, and let him empty her workbox. He stood close to his father, with great rosy cheeks and wide-open blue eyes, looking first up at Mr. Cleves and then down at the coffin, and thinking he and Chubby would play at that when they got home. The burial was over, and Amos turned with his children to re-enter the house where, an hour ago, Milly's dear body lay, where the windows were half darkened, and sorrow seemed to have a hallowed precinct for itself, shut out from the world. But now she was gone. The broad, snow-reflected daylight was in all the rooms. The vicarage again seemed part of the common working-day world, and Amos, for the first time, felt that he was alone, that day after day, month after month, year after year would have to be lived through without Milly's love. Spring would come, and she would not be there. Summer, and she would not be there, and he would never have her again with him by the fireside in the long evenings. The seasons all seemed irksome to his thoughts, and how dreary the sunshiny days that would be sure to come. She was gone from him, and he could never show her his love any more, never make up for omissions in the past by filling future days with tenderness. Oh, the anguish of that thought that we can never atone to our dead for the stinted affection we gave them, for the light answers we returned to their plaints or their pleadings, for the little reverence we showed to that sacred human soul that lived so close to us and was the divinest thing God had given us to know. Amos Barton had been an affectionate husband, and while Milly was with him he was never visited by the thought that perhaps his sympathy with her was not quick and watchful enough. But now he relived all their life together with that terrible keenness of memory and imagination which bereavement gives, and he felt as if his very love needed a pardon for its poverty and selfishness. No outward solace could counteract the bitterness of this inward woe. But outward solace came. Cold faces looked kind again, and parishioners turned over in their minds what they could best do to help their pastor. Mr. Oldinport wrote to express his sympathy, and enclosed another £20 note, begging that he might be permitted to contribute in this way to the relief of Mr. Barton's mind from pecuniary anxieties, under the pressure of a grief which all his parishioners must share, and offering his interest towards placing the 2 eldest girls in a school expressly founded for clergymen's daughters. Mr. Cleves succeeded in collecting £30 among his richer clerical brethren, and, adding £10 himself, sent the sum to Amos with the kindest and most delicate words of Christian fellowship and manly friendship. Miss Jackson forgot old grievances, and came to stay some months with Milly's children, bringing such material aid as she could spare from her small income. These were substantial helps, which relieved Amos from the pressure of his money difficulties, and the friendly attentions, the kind pressure of the hand, the cordial looks he met with everywhere in his parish, made him feel that the fatal frost which had settled on his pastoral duties during the Countess's residence at the vicarage was completely thawed, and that the hearts of his parishioners were once more open to him. No one breathed the Countess's name now, for Milly's memory hallowed her husband, as of old the place was hallowed on which an angel from God had alighted. When the spring came, Mrs. Hackett begged that she might have Dicky to stay with her, and great was the enlargement of Dicky's experience from that visit. Every morning he was allowed, being well wrapped up as to his chest by Mrs. Hackett's own hands, but very bare and red as to his legs, to run loose in the cow and poultry yard, to persecute the turkey-cock by satirical imitations of his gobble-gobble, and to put difficult questions to the groom as to the reasons why horses had 4 legs, and other transcendental matters. Then Mr. Hackett would take Dicky up on horseback when he rode round his farm, and Mrs. Hackett had a large plum-cake in cut, ready to meet incidental attacks of hunger. So that Dicky had considerably modified his views as to the desirability of Mrs. Hackett's kisses. The Misses Farquhar made particular pets of Fred and Sophie, to whom they undertook to give lessons twice a week in writing and geography, and Mrs. Farquhar devised many treats for the little ones. Paddy's treat was to stay at home or walk about with her papa, and when he sat by the fire in an evening, after the other children were gone to bed, she would bring a stool, and, placing it against his feet, would sit down upon it and lean her head against his knee. Then his hand would rest on that fair head, and he would feel that Milly's love was not quite gone out of his life. So the time wore on till it was May again, and the church was quite finished and reopened in all its new splendour, and Mr. Barton was devoting himself with more vigour than ever to his parochial duties. But one morning It was a very bright morning, and evil tidings sometimes like to fly in the finest weather. There came a letter for Mr. Barton addressed in the vicar's handwriting. Amos opened it with some anxiety. Somehow or other he had a presentiment of evil. The letter contained the announcement that Mr. Carp had resolved on coming to reside at Shepperton, and that consequently in 6 months from that time Mr. Barton's duties as curate in that parish would be closed. Oh, it was hard. Just when Shepperton had become the place where he most wished to stay, where he had friends who knew his sorrows, where he lived close to Milly's grave. To part from that grave seemed like parting with Milly a second time, for Amos was one who clung to all the material links between his mind and the past. His imagination was not vivid and required the stimulus of actual perception. It roused some bitter feeling, too, to think that Mr. Carp's wish to reside at Shepperton was merely a pretext for removing Mr. Barton, in order that he might ultimately give the curacy of Shepperton to his own brother-in-law, who was known to be wanting a new position. Still, it must be borne, and the painful business of seeking another curacy must be set about without loss of time. After the lapse of some months, Amos was obliged to renounce the hope of getting one at all near Shepperton, and he at length resigned himself to accepting one in a distant county. The parish was in a large manufacturing town, where his walks would lie among noisy streets and dingy alleys, and where the children would have no garden to play in, no pleasant farmhouses to visit. It was another blow inflicted on the bruised man. Chapter 10. At length the dreaded week was come when Amos and his children must leave Shepperton. There was general regret among the parishioners at his departure. Not that any one of them thought his spiritual gifts preeminent, or was conscious of great edification from his ministry, but his recent troubles had called out their better sympathies, and that is always a source of love. Amos failed to touch the spring of goodness by his sermons, but he touched it effectually by his sorrows, and there was now a real bond between him and his flock. "My heart aches for them poor motherless children," said Mrs. Hackett to her husband, "are going among strangers and into a nasty town where there's no good victuals to be had, and you must pay dear to get bad uns." Mrs. Hackett had a vague notion of a town life as a combination of dirty backyards, measly pork, and dingy linen. The same sort of sympathy was strong among the poorer class of parishioners. Old stiff-jointed Mr. Tozer, who was still able to earn a little by gardening jobs, stopped Mrs. Cramp, the charwoman, on her way home from the vicarage, where she'd been helping Nanny to pack up the day before the departure, and inquired very particularly into Mr. Barton's prospects. "Ah, poor mon," he was heard to say, "I'm sorry for un. He ain't much here, but he will be worse off there. Half a loaf's better nor near none." The sad goodbyes had all been said before that last evening, and after all the packing was done and all the arrangements were made, Amos felt the oppression of that blank interval in which one has nothing left to think of but the dreary future, the separation from the loved and familiar, and the chilling entrance on the new and strange. In every parting there is an image of death. Soon after 10 o'clock, when he had sent Nanny to bed that she might have a good night's rest before the fatigues of the morrow, he stole softly out to pay a last visit to Milly's grave. It was a moonless night, but the sky was thick with stars, and their light was enough to show that the grass had grown long on the grave, and that there was a tombstone telling in bright letters on a dark ground that beneath were deposited the remains of Amelia, the beloved wife of Amos Barton, who died in the 35th year of her age, leaving a husband and 6 children to lament her loss. The final words of the inscription were, "Thy will be done." The husband was now advancing towards the dear mound from which he was so soon to be parted, perhaps for ever. He stood a few minutes reading over and over again the words on the tombstone, as if to assure himself that all the happy and unhappy past was a reality. For love is frightened at the intervals of insensibility and callousness that encroach by little and little on the dominion of grief, and it makes efforts to recall the keenness of the first anguish. Gradually, as his eye dwelt on the words "Amelia, the beloved wife," the waves of feeling swelled within his soul, and he threw himself on the grave, clasping it with his arms and kissing the cold turf. "Milly, Milly, dost thou hear me? I didn't love thee enough, I wasn't tender enough to thee, but I think of it all now." The sobs came and choked his utterance, and the warm tears fell. Conclusion. Only once again in his life has Amos Barton visited Milly's grave. It was in the calm and softened light of an autumnal afternoon, and he was not alone. He held on his arm a young woman with a sweet, grave face, which strongly recalled the expression of Mrs. Barton's, but was less lovely in form and colour. She was about 30, but there were some premature lines round her mouth and eyes which told of early anxiety. Amos himself was much changed. His thin circlet of hair was nearly white, and his walk was no longer firm and upright. But his glance was calm and even cheerful, and his neat linen told of a woman's care. Milly did not take all her love from the earth when she died. She left some of it in Paddy's heart. All the other children were now grown up and had gone their several ways. Dicky, you will be glad to hear, had shown remarkable talents as an engineer. His cheeks are still ruddy in spite of mixed mathematics, and his eyes are still large and blue. But in other respects his person would present no marks of identification for his friend Mrs. Hackett if she were to see him, especially now that her eyes must be grown very dim with the wear of more than 20 additional years. He is nearly 6 feet high and has a proportionately broad chest. He wears spectacles and rubs his large white hands through a mass of shaggy brown hair. But I'm sure you have no doubt that Mr. Richard Barton is a thoroughly good fellow as well as a man of talent, and you will be glad any day to shake hands with him, for his own sake as well as his mother's. Paddy alone remains by her father's side, and makes the evening sunshine of his life.